Hello everyone, my name is Allegra Integra and this is my little booktube channel. I am here to talk about my March wrap-up. I know as of filming this that I haven't uploaded or even filmed anything in about a month, I think a little bit over. That's not because I've been in a reading slump, that's not because I don't want to do this anymore. It's kind of a twofold thing, maybe three. So I have been trying to kind of upgrade my setup, not necessarily the room. This isn't gonna change anytime soon, but I tried to get a webcam with a built-in microphone to help with the sound. However, instead of being smart and researching and looking at what other YouTubers, booktubers, hobby tubers, I guess, have been using, I just kind of grabbed something that seemed like it was in my budget and it was under budget. And it turns out that the internal mic is terrible and the camera is just okay. My Pixel 3 actually continues to have both better sound quality and a better camera. I am using the ring light that came with it, and I bought a tripod as well, so I no longer have you like precariously stacked on library books that might or might not be due soon. I'm also not quite sure if I want this to be a book review specific channel, if I want to do individual reviews, if I'm planning on doing any kind of like games around books. That doesn't really feel like my style, but I'd love to start having conversations, deeper conversations, either about genres, about author concepts, about literature and analyzing it, even though I'm an amateur, as well as more in-depth reviews on books that really grab me, whether I hate them or I love them. And I'm still trying to figure out how I want that to look. But this is a wrap up. We know what those are, so I'm going to get right into it. In the month of March, I finished seven books, which I am plowing through my goal this year, you guys. I was planning on reading 40 books this year, and as of today, when I'm filming this, I'm already halfway there, and we're just over a third of the way through the year. So I might need to re-look at that goal, but that's a good thing, right? So we'll just start from the beginning because that makes the most sense. The first book that I read in March was The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin. I am so glad I finally got to this. I don't know why I kept putting it off. This is the third in the Broken Earth trilogy. I feel like endings can often be a disappointment because we have built things up. I don't know if because I wasn't waiting for this, it was already published, that I didn't have that same slow build and that like build up of expectation. I actually don't think that's what it is. What it is it's a masterpiece. It is a wonderful wrap up of the entire series. I want to do a more in-depth like review of the entire series as a whole that also includes spoilers because there's so much to talk about in this series. It went from what feels like to me a very strict fantasy setting. I have a really janky setup and my light just fell down. So if it looks a little different, I'm sorry. Anyway, where was I? The first book starts very strongly and very obviously to me as a fantasy setting. It is a fantasy setting. By the time you get to the third book, it has firmly planted its feet in the sci-fantasy genre. I am still like figuring out exactly how I would define that. I'm at the point of like setting books in genres myself where it's like I know it when I see it, which is not a critical way to look at books or at genre. But by the end of this series, it definitely has its feet firmly in sci-fantasy or sci-fi fantasy. Like a lot of second books, The Obelisk Gate, which I read before this, second books and trilogies often struggle with second book syndrome, and I do think Obelisk Gate suffered from that. The quality of the writing was the same, but the way that the story moved forward did slow down, did not grab me as much as the first book. But unlike a lot of more modern trilogies that I've read as an adult, I think that The Stone Sky brings the entire story together. I'm being really vague since this is the third book in a series, so I don't want to give much away. In case you didn't know, the Broken Earth trilogy is set in a fantasy which becomes a sci-fantasy world where there are seasons that are the result of cataclysmic events that are usually earthquakes, eruptions, things that would happen underneath the Earth's crust that are going to impact life above it. And those fifth seasons are considered death. And the first book opens with what is looking to be the last season. And there's a reason that this is happening, and the characters through the whole 3 books kind of come up with a solution without it being super easy or wrapped up beautifully, which I will get to that later. I thought it was brilliant. It was a wonderful way to tie everything in. I think the 3rd book elevates the 2nd book because when you look at this as a full story, everything comes together and it's just magnificent. Clearly deserving of all the Hugos that this got. I don't think I mentioned the rating earlier. This is clearly a 5-star read for me. I will reread the series. I plan on purchasing it, and I would love there to be a special edition. I haven't found one yet, but if one does get released, I will get my hands on that. So next in the month of March, I finished Dearly by Margaret Atwood, or Maggie Atts, the lovely Canadian who is responsible for bringing us The Handmaid's Tale. You should read Oryx and Crake if you read The Handmaid's Tale, 100%. But I digress, because I did not read that this month. I read my first poetry collection by her. I loved this book so much that I went and bought a copy. I initially got this from the library, but because of my goal of reading more poetry this year, and now knowing I want to read more long-form poetry and more traditional, I don't know if that's the right term. I'm not a literary educated, so I don't know the style. This is called free verse poem. I want to annotate this. I want to go through it, and you don't do that to library books, so I went and purchased a copy myself. I ended up giving this collection 4 stars. It is a little bit uneven at times, and I am not the biggest fan of like nature poetry, but the poems that she hits it on really hard shouldn't be surprising if you've read her other work, commenting on women's bodies being commodified. And I do believe that the last poems were written after her husband, spouse, life partner passed away, I believe in 2020. And they are so poignant and so sad. This is going to sound so like shallow compared to that, but there's also a really early poem in here called Ghost Cat that beautifully talks about a pet cat suffering from dementia. My cat is almost 17 and this is her. Like, it's her. So a little biased right now. That's the 2nd poem in the collection, and I was sold at that point. Definitely a little bit of unevenness, especially with the nature poems. Although there's also a poem in here called Upside Down Slug Sex, which I want to annotate and look deeper into. So that's the level of like emotion and concept and humor that comes through this copy, and I absolutely had to own it because I will write in this because it belongs to me now. And then I read Plain Bad Heroines by Emily M. Danforth. I believe this is Danforth's first adult novel, and it is a chonker. It has some really beautiful Edward Gorey-esque illustrations in it as well. And this is kind of a modern twist on Gothic horror, and it is quite a book. This is a plot. All right. How do you describe this plot? Because there's a lot going on. It starts off where you're in a school in Rhode Island, a boarding school in Rhode Island in the early 1900s, and some young women die tragically, and they were members of the Plain Bad Heroines Club. And the Plain Bad Heroines Club at the school were people who were obsessed with Mary McLean's diary, which is a real book, like in our universe that exists. And then there's a modern timeline that follows 3 young women, one who wrote a book about what happened because of the Plain Bad Heroines Club in the early 1900s, and the other young women are making a movie based on that person's book about what happened around that book. So it's got layers. There's also like a mysterious baby, and is this magic? Is this not magic? Is it just people going mad because they aren't handling themselves well because of the times that they're in and the pressures that they have? Some of the parallels in the stories were a little weird, but I love a slow gothic horror. I love a sapphic gothic horror, and this book is very gay. And it kind of turns a few things on its head because all of the characters in the initial like event that caused all of this other stuff to happen died, and they were all lesbians who died, which kind of touches on that barrier gaze trope. But so many of these characters are bisexual or lesbians, and there's also gay representation in some side characters, and it's a little uneven. The drawings and the slow vibe of it and the creepy vibe of it really charmed me. You'll hear this a lot from me. Like, I loved this book. I don't know if I could recommend it to very many people because the build-up in the modern story doesn't quite match the build-up in the Victorian era story. But I did give it 4 stars because if we're going on my enjoyment, which is kind of where I'm at right now, I really enjoyed this. The illustrations and the way that the creeping horror, it was just done beautifully, and it absolutely matches the tone of other gothic literature that I've read before. I'm a big fan of Wuthering Heights, so I can deal with a slow burn and I can deal with messed up things that people are being overly dramatic about things that they shouldn't be. And they're the product of their time. Like, that is my jam. So I really did like this book. It's just so slow and character driven. I can't recommend it if people are expecting it to be like a big sapphic love story, because that's not, well, their sexualities are all kind of intermingled. It's not really about love. It's sort of about identity, but it's a lot more about like melodrama, which I adore. But yeah, a good 4 stars for me, and I also purchased that one, and it's sitting on my bookshelf because it's pretty. Whoo boy. The next book that I read in March was Tender is the Flesh by Agustina Bazterrica. I believe that's how you say it. It's Spanish, Argentinian Spanish, and it was translated by Sarah Moses. This is a dystopian novel that's also a horror novel, but I don't know that it's been categorized that way. It's sci-fi dystopia, near dystopia. And I don't feel sick reading books very often. I can handle a lot of really hard topics when I'm reading. It's different with movies, but like if I'm reading, I can handle some really rough stuff, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. Nonfiction clearly will get to me a little more when we're talking about it, particularly if it's written very well. But I can usually read gore, I can read thrillers that have torture scenes. But this book, the writer and the translator did such a phenomenal job in explaining this, and I haven't even told you what it's about yet. So the premise is there was a virus that made it impossible for humans to eat animal meat. So the government has determined that it is okay to harvest human meat, but it's done in a very similar way that we would have harvested animals prior. People are specifically raised for it. There's factory farms, there's genetic testing. They aren't seen as sentient, even though people know they're human. You aren't allowed to say that they're human. And this book follows a man who works at a processing plant for meat, special meat. They call it special meat, which is human meat because you can't eat animal meat anymore. So it's kind of Brave New World meets cannibalism. And it's very bleak. The women in it are written in such a way that it was hard at first for me to believe a woman wrote this book. But I think it's almost like a black comedy or a satire, kind of along the way of American Psycho as well. If you had trouble with American Psycho, don't read this book. It's just so cold. And I'm a vegetarian. Like, I don't eat meat. I haven't eaten meat for a long time. But I don't think that if I did eat meat that I would have been able to read this book at all. It is so rough. It's very dehumanizing on purpose. The ending hit me like a ton of bricks. I want to do a dedicated video to this. I don't know that I am articulate enough to get into everything that I was feeling on this book, but I gave it 4 stars because I literally had to set it down and walk away because my stomach was turning. And again, I don't get bothered that way by books. Like, I will cry at books and stuff, don't get me wrong, but like, I don't usually get that grossed out. I might go, ugh, but this was rough. So I still gave it 4 stars, kind of on the low 4, not completely sure about the way that all of the women were portrayed, in particular a butcher woman. There's a sexual encounter that kind of parallels the way that the meat is treated, the special meat, the people. Ultimately what happens plot-wise is the main character is given a female special meat, and you can legally have them in your home as a gift, and he doesn't want to deal with it, and then it goes from there. And the pressures of the way the society has been going, and his questions about ethics, and is there even really a virus in the meat? It's a lot in a really short book. I thought it was brilliant. I want to pick it apart. Again, not something I can necessarily recommend. Not for the same reasons as Plain Bad Heroines. If you have any kind of squeamishness, don't go into this with caution. It's intense, and it pretty much has every trigger warning you can think of. So go with caution. I think it's brilliant, but really hard to read. So swinging the pendulum from super, super bleak to probably overly optimistic, I read The Lion Shall Slaughter the Lamb by Margaret Killjoy, which I gave 5 stars. This is kind of like a speculative fiction fantasy novel. Some people said it was horror. I don't think it's horror. About a woman named Danielle Kane. She is a punk who is found her way to Freedom, Iowa, where there's an intentional community where her friend used to live until he left and ended up taking his own life, and she's wanting to find out why that happened. She's kind of like a grifter, kind of crust punk, and a lot of the individuals in this community are the same way. There's a ton of trans rep, there is queer rep, there is the intentional community aspect of it, but why is this working? Well, there is a 3-antlered deer named Liski who her friend and a few others in the community brought forward, who is now potentially going to risk the community because he came as a guardian and he's starting to kill folks in the community that maybe have done wrong, but they don't know what that wrong could have been. So there's a little bit of horror to that. It's kind of cheeky, it's a little silly, and the moral of it is like pretty forward because without spoiling much, it has a lot of conversations about power and non-hierarchical communities. There is a sequel to it that I will probably pick up because it's going to be a nice short read. It's not a perfect book, but it's definitely a new favorite. It picked me up, the positivity, even if it was unrealistic that that a community like that would exist in Freedom, Iowa. I'm from the Midwest. Yeah, but I can be optimistic and hopeful, and after Tender is the Flesh, it was a nice palate cleanser, despite also having some less than pleasant imagery in it, because that's where my mind lies. But it was a joy to read, and I can't wait to read the next one. All right, and next in March, I completed reading The Prairie of the Orange Tree. I read this with my partner, and he liked it more than I did. I gave this 3 stars, and I'm going to have a hard time talking about it because I gave it 3 stars because it was fine. It was fine. It's like 900 pages long. That doesn't bother me, but it was fine. It didn't need to be 900 pages long. It was touted to me as like a feminist Lord of the Rings epic. I love Lord of the Rings. I recognize its flaws. Don't get me wrong. But maybe I just wasn't in the mood for this book. But I felt that it was very unsurprising. And And maybe that's why it gets its Lord of the Rings comparison. It's not written like Lord of the Rings. It's not a Lord of the Rings retelling. Like, it is its own story. And it's about different kingdoms. You have 4 different... see, I'm already forgetting. You have 4 different points of view. There is Aed, who is a woman from the prairie who is kind of acting as a protector to this Queen Sabran. And then there is you follow an alchemist who has been exiled, and he's been exiled to an island. We also follow a lord of the court, where Aed is a lady of the court. He has kind of been exiled by like their sheriff, to go find some information about what has happened to one of their country's allies, because they fell to the dragons. Dragons are bad guys, according to most of the world. And then you have Saiki, the Saiki character, which is kind of like an Eastern Asia analog country. I believe it kind of was influenced by Japan. And Tane is the character there, and she's training to be a dragon rider because the Saiki see the dragons as gods. And they specifically will ride on Eastern dragons, and then the Western dragons have caused problems, with the most famous one being called the Nameless One. And Sabran's line has always women. They always have one daughter. It's a queendom, not a kingdom. And there's a whole bunch of conversation and stuff about that. And there are gay characters, and there's an asexual character. And I just didn't care that much. It was fine. It was fine. And March started off strong and ended really poorly. So I guess started off with 4 and 5 stars and went out with 3 and 1 stars, because my last read for March was something I was really looking forward to, and it sucked. And that is The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Penner. If you love this book, if you liked this book, that's awesome. I'm glad that it worked for you. That's great. Like, I'm going to get harsh here. Do not take that as any kind of judgment on people who did like this book, but this was terrible. This was terrible. 1 star. 1 star. The premise was so promising. Like, the blurb here. I'll try to read it pretty fast. Hidden in the depths of 18th century London, a secret apothecary shop caters to an unusual kind of clientele. Women across the city whisper of a mysterious figure named Nella, who sells well-disguised poisons to use against the oppressive men in their lives. Nella's dark world is no place for her newest patron, a precocious 12-year-old named Eliza Fanning, but their unexpected bond sparks a string of consequences that echoes through the centuries. That sounds amazing. It goes on. 200 years later, aspiring historian Caroline Parswell discovers an aged apothecary vial in the River Thames. As she is newly grappling with the searing betrayal of her husband's infidelity, a curious research project is exactly the distraction Caroline needs. But when she discovers a link between the vial and London's long-unsolved apothecary murders, Caroline's upended present soon collides with an explosive history, binding her fate to Nella's and Eliza's in a stunning twist that transcends the barrier of time. And it was marketed as historical fantasy. This cover is beautiful. That blurb is amazing. I am disappointed. I'm blown away at how disappointed I was by this. The writing itself is very boring. How do you make this premise boring? It's very uneven. So there are 3 points of view. There's Nella, who is an aging woman in 1791, Eliza, who is a 12-year-old in 1791, and Caroline, who is a 35-year-old in present day. I was like, oh, there will be difference in their voices. You could open any chapter and read a line of dialogue, and the only thing that would give them any voice is that Nella calls Eliza child instead of her name, like over and over and over again. And I'm just like scratching the iceberg. You'd think that this would be something that has maybe a little magical realism or like slight soft magic in it. And there kind of is at the end. Like, she just pulled plot out of nowhere. It made no sense. Caroline's story was obnoxious. She was very whiny. She made some really stupid decisions. And there's some stuff that she does at the end that is very confusing and makes no sense. I thought this was going to be like a really well researched view of poisonings and how that was like a woman's weapon at the time, and that we would get to follow a couple different murders and kind of look at that gray morality. And that was not this at all. This is probably more like new adult, like exposing people to something that's a little bit dark with no historical accuracy. There were police in 1791. No, like, no, that's not how it worked. And just a number of things that I don't make sense in this book. It's poorly written, the characters are annoying, and all anyone cares about is babies, is having babies. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to have babies, but literally the way that the like moral of these women like that come to is like finding their own selves and being upset about not having babies or being upset about having babies with no real nuance or explanation or a like conversation about it. I'm going to do a deeper review on this. This is terrible. I'm so disappointed. Bad book. First 1 star of the year. I rarely do that. So hopefully April will be better. That's all that I have. If you have read anything that I've read that you liked, disagreed with me, please let me know. And I will see you next time. Bye.